Welcome back to the Strength Connect podcast. In today's episode, I had Dr. Eric Trexler on the show. Eric previously held a USAPL state squat record in powerlifting and earned his pro status as a drug-free bodybuilder after coming from a background in baseball, football, and wrestling throughout his high school days. Since 2009, Eric has been coaching a variety of different athletes, including wrestlers, football players, and Special Olympics powerlifters. More recently, he has pivoted towards helping people reach a wide range of fitness and wellness goals through his online coaching programs at Trexler Fitness LLC. Eric has obtained bachelor's and master's degrees in exercise science and completed a PhD in human movement science at UNC Chapel Hill. While pursuing his degrees, he completed extensive coursework related to movement, exercise, nutrition, metabolism, psychology, and behavior change. Trexler has since published over 50 peer-reviewed papers and a few different book chapters. Most of his research is focused on practical strategies to help people get bigger, stronger, leaner, healthier, and more athletic. Currently, he's conducting metabolism research out of Duke University. This podcast is brought to you by VPA Supplements Australia. If you'd like to save 10% off their range of products and supplements, you can use my code Hayden10 at checkout, or alternatively, the link in the show notes. Yeah, so Eric, thanks for coming on the podcast today. It's a pleasure to have you on, and no doubt there'll be plenty of great insights today. I'm looking to talk to you about a whole host of different things, including, how fast, is a practical weight loss amount week to week during a deficit or when you're in a cut, and also some of the different considerations around not only fat loss, but also muscle gain during an off season. And I guess, what are the practical amounts of lean muscle tissue that we can expect to gain, when in a surplus, if you're a natural athlete versus, being on PEDs or using synthetic compounds. So thanks for joining us today, and it's a pleasure to have you. I know for me it's 11 p.m. here, and so we've got a little bit of a time difference, but it's fantastic to connect. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on. Happy to be here. And yeah, it's about 9 in the morning over here, so we're about as far away as you can get with time differences. But hopefully you don't mind staying up late to accommodate the American over here.
Well, one of the distinctions that I've heard you make is the distinction between the lean muscle tissue and the muscle mass that we typically can expect to lose when we're in a deficit, particularly for those individuals that are seeking to achieve stage-ready conditioning. One of the things I want to talk to you about, and hopefully provide a bit of an insight for the listeners as well, who some of those that may have not got to that level of conditioning required for a bodybuilding competition. What kind of strategies can we utilize in practice to kind of attenuate that loss of muscle mass when in a strict kind of dieting phase, based on a lot of the research that you've done?
Yeah, well, definitely. I mean, the most important thing you could possibly do is do resistance training and do it effectively. And no one would question that. That's pretty obvious. But by the time most people ask me that question, that's already a given. Just the people who follow my content generally lift weights already. But there's no question in terms of magnitudes. It's important to state that, because that's the biggest thing we could do by far. There's probably, I would say, 2 other major levers that we can pull to try to minimize muscle loss or the loss of fat-free mass during a diet. Number 1 would be making sure you're eating adequate protein. And so we actually have me and Martin Refalo. I'm not sure how he pronounces his last name, but
podcast.
yeah, it's one of those things. I email him often as collaborators, but I've never said his last name. I've only typed it. Yeah, but yeah, because he's on the other side of the world. But yeah, so he and I and Eric Helms we've got a meta regression in review right now which I hope will be published soon. But that analysis basically found that if you're a lean person who is in an energy deficit, we do find that higher protein intakes do appear to facilitate the preservation of fat-free mass, presumably a decent portion of that being muscle mass. So that is an important lever that we can pull, but the effect size is pretty modest. So it's one of those things where if someone came to me and they said, "Hey, I'm not super," let's just say, for example, someone is, they've got a BMI of 45. Their doctor said, "Hey, I'd like you to lose 60 or 70 pounds." With that individual, I'm not super worried right out of the gates about saying, "Hey, we need to really optimize protein intake here," because frankly, we need to just make sure we're making strides toward that weight loss goal and we don't need to overcomplicate things. So like, that becomes more of an issue when you're saying, I need to maintain every gram of muscle tissue I can. I'm a lean person. I'm dieting for some type of athletic endeavor. That's where we start to see that, it's really important to be mindful of that protein when, the target is to really fully optimize the retention of fat-free mass. So that's the one thing we can do. And then the other lever we can pull is just making sure that we have a conservative rate of weight loss. And really what we mean by that, by extension, is a conservative caloric deficit. The body's pretty good. You'll have to forgive me. I'm currently, my research is in an evolutionary anthropology department. So sometimes I drift into kind of evolutionary rationale and justification. But, the human body's really good at sensing when it has a shortfall or a surplus of energy. And it's pretty darn good at adjusting accordingly. Now, it's not perfect because we can absolutely gain excessive amounts of weight and we can absolutely starve to death. There are there are limits to how much we can adapt to our energetic surroundings. But when we are in a position of dramatically insufficient energy, the body can certainly sense that through a number of mechanisms, and it certainly increases the likelihood, both mechanistically and just based on the applied longitudinal data. It seems that when we put our body through a really large energy deficit, we are considerably more likely to lose fat-free mass, because at the end of the day, that kind of state, that massive energy deficit, basically would signal, hey, times are tough here. We need to ditch what we can in order to conserve energy. It takes a lot more energy to maintain fat-free mass than it does fat mass. Fat mass is our prized storage of extra energy. So it is very intuitive that when we put our body through a really remarkably large energy deficit, that we're more likely to let go of some of that fat-free mass that tends to be more energy intensive, or energetically costly to maintain. So once again, that's a scenario where it becomes increasingly important as the person gets leaner. So again, if I'm starting with someone who is, like I said, a BMI of 45, doctor said, hey, I'm worried about your blood lipids. I'm worried about your glycemic control. We need to lose a bunch of weight as quickly as we can. With that person, I'm not going to say, hey, whoa. We should only be losing, 0.25% of body weight per week or whatever. I'm not going to be slamming the brakes on, because we just need to be making strides, getting into that lower BMI range, and getting some of those other biomarkers within the reference ranges. But once we start getting into the concept of, okay, we're trying to get really lean here and we're trying to optimize the process, that's where you do want to make sure that you're being a bit more on the conservative side with how quickly you're doing it and how large your deficit is.
I kind of want to dig into a couple of points there that you raised. The first one being the optimal protein consumption to preserve muscle during a deficit. Now, I know that Eric Helms had some research he published previously. I think it was a systematic review, which found that up to even 3 grams of protein per kilogram of lean muscle tissue or fat-free mass was almost optimal to preserve muscle tissue during a deficit. Now, I think this is probably one of those things in the health and fitness industry, which is very um, misunderstood or misinterpreted. So maybe could you break that down for the listeners in a more practical sense, particularly those that won't have access to, say, a DEXA, where they can actually determine the amount of lean muscle versus fat mass they have on their body. I guess when you look at things from a just per kilogram or per pound of body weight more broadly.
Yeah, I mean, I think generally speaking, my kind of like rough conversions here. I might have a document that could give me a solid number, but usually, when you're not in an energy deficit, when you're just like, hey, I'm trying to build some muscle, people often say you should have 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilogram of total body mass when it comes to your daily protein intake. And when I scale that to a fat-free mass recommendation, I usually say 2.0 to 2.75 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass. So we could certainly reverse engineer those numbers on the fly, but the general take home is, if you're pushing up into that closer to the 3 grams per kilogram of fat-free mass, you're talking about going pretty comfortably above, in many cases, 2.2 grams per kilogram of total body mass. So not quite up to 3, but above 2.2 by a reasonably comfortable margin there. But I will say this. I do hesitate to take it that direction because, I think there's very good reason why the original publication did scale things to fat-free mass. I do think that that's the more scalable recommendation, especially when you consider a wide spectrum of body composition ranges. Now, granted, this does get exceedingly more important the leaner you get. But what I usually tell people is like, okay, you don't have access to a DEXA, right? And that's fine. Even if you did, I'm not, as someone who's probably run comfortably over 1,000 DEXAs, I don't even like it for individual measurements. I've seen shredded people who get measured at 12% on a DEXA, and I'm like, no, you're like 6. And then I've also seen people who, I mean, for me, I did a DEXA on myself when I was about halfway through a prep, maybe 2/3 of the way through a prep, and it said I was 6% body fat. And I wasn't. So, basically, if you're going for like group measurements, DEXA is fantastic, because we're going to get some overestimation, some underestimation. It's going to be pretty random, not super systematically biased. We can take the average of that sample and feel pretty good about it. But for an individual, it's like, if this really matters, right? So it's really important to recognize that, Helms's original systematic review, which is basically what we're updating with our paper that's currently in review. The reason that the sample size is so small in that original systematic review is because it's specifically for people who are lean and resistance training, right? And body fat percentage generally gets easier to roughly estimate the leaner you get, right? So if I'm looking at someone who's pretty lean, it's not really that hard to get within, let's say, plus or minus a few body fat percentage points, right? You can look at someone and say, okay, you're maybe 13-ish versus, they look dramatically different from someone who's 7, right? Percent body fat. So all of that is to say, I don't see the limitation of not having access to body composition estimation tools as a huge barrier or impediment. I'd say just ballpark it, give it a guess, look up, there's all sorts of charts online that say, hey, here's what a male with 10% body fat looks like. Here's what a female with, 18% body fat looks like. You can see these different charts, and just eyeballing it for individual level estimates is close enough for the type of math we're doing here. So I still would probably recommend just taking that extra step going by fat-free mass, because that's just kind of where the data seem to be strongest. We found, if memory serves, in the paper that's currently in review, we did find that going by fat-free mass was a little bit better than going by total body mass, just in terms of how explanatory or predictive that relationship is between the variables. So I generally like to frame protein as relative to fat-free mass rather than total body mass.
Yeah, I guess one of those things that we talk about often, as you said, so that 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram or per kilogram of body weight doesn't really take into consideration, does it, the lean muscle tissue or the fat mass on the individual. So you could be starting a prep with someone who's got a larger amount of fat mass to, lean muscle tissue. So I think looking at it looking at it in the context of fat-free mass does seem to make a lot more sense in that respect. If, as you say, got access to, or you don't even need access, as you say, but you could have some calipers, skin fold calipers. Although the other thing with that is that as you get leaner too, there also seems to be improved repeatability of those skin fold measurements as well. If you try to take those measurements on a considerably larger individual with more fat mass, it does seem to be a bit less repeatable, those measures. But I understand when you were doing your PhD, I think you really had a tedious time with the MRI, working in the physics laboratory at the time. And can you tell us
Yeah.
about that experience and what you learned, I guess, measuring in the context of body composition with MRIs?
Yeah, so I'm sure that when you're going for more, at least I hope. I don't know. I haven't dug into an MRI focused method section in a couple years, I don't think. I would imagine that when you're going for a pretty standard outcome, like just total body composition, hopefully now they have some good algorithms and kind of machine learning based tools that you can use to just say, hey, here's this giant MRI file. Please go in and figure out how much is fat mass and how much is fat-free tissue. I hope and assume that that's the case, that a lot of that has been automated, especially with the kind of data science and computational power we have that we have these days. But for my project, we were actually focused on brown adipose tissue, a much less common thing to be imaging, especially on MRI. Like usually you're going to do CT scans and you're going to use fluorodeoxyglucose tracer to kind of label that brown adipose tissue with some kind of stimulus to promote uptake, usually cold exposure. So that whole like PET CT with the fluorodeoxyglucose, the FDG tracer, that's the standard approach to doing it. We were trying to see if we could get a similar signal, a similar method of estimating brown adipose tissue activity and quantity using MRI and a different kind of tracer that was basically like a xenon gas preparation. And so what we were doing with the MRI was a little bit off the beaten path, so it had to be done very manually. And yeah, so it's doing any kind of manual analysis in MRIs is kind of brutal because, MRI is infinitely better than DEXA for body comp if it's done correctly, because it just has to be. So, DEXA is taking a 3D body and turning it into a 2D image, right? And so what a lot of people don't realize with that is a huge number of the pixels. When we turn a 3D body into a 2D image, we have this map of pixels that looks like the outline of a human body, and we can see the skeleton and all that stuff. Any pixel that has bone in it, which is a huge percentage of the pixels, it's either 40 or 60%. I forget how the split goes that way. And of course, it's going to depend on body shape, adiposity, things like that. But needless to say, a massive number of the pixels are going to have bone in them. And you cannot really use that pixel to make any estimation of fat mass versus fat-free mass. The density of the bone just completely throws that off. So what a lot of people don't realize is with a DEXA scan, you take a 3D human, you turn them into a 2D image, and then you throw out a massive chunk of it when you're actually going in to estimate the relative proportions of fat mass and fat-free mass. MRI is taking a 3D person and turning it into a 3D image. And so you do not have that limitation, and you can go in as much detail as you like, ultimately based on the type of equipment you're using. Different MRI machines, different units have different granularity and sensitivity and precision and things like that. But the challenge then is, instead of looking at one 2D image of this person, you can think of, we're going to look at a 2D image that starts with just the tip of your nose. And then we're going to do another 2D image right below that. And we're going to work our way through these like digital slices of a human body until we're all the way to the back of your head, right? And so it's just a tedious, painstaking process where you are kind of analyzing a huge number of images that are just stacked on top of each other. So yeah, it was extremely tedious, but a good learning experience and a really fun project involved with really, really, really smart people over in the physics department. It was a lot of fun.
And so, it sounds that way, like very tedious. I guess the different layers that you're going through, sifting through there.
Yeah.
In terms of the weight loss for short-term protocols versus longer-term dieting protocols, I guess the longer-term 30-plus week preps are a lot more popularized these days with diet breaks and refeeds and, doing things in a lot slower manner seems to be sustainable for a lot of people. Although you do see some information out there at the moment, which is also becoming quite popularized around, short-term protein modified sparing fast. There's mini cuts and these kind of things where, do you see any benefit to getting in and out of a diet as quickly as possible, say like a 12-week prep as opposed to over the course of 30 weeks? Is there any greater risk to losing more lean muscle tissue the longer you are in a quite hefty calorie deficit? What's your kind of take on, what's going to be more beneficial for an individual in terms of preserving their muscle mass, or is it completely individualized?
Yeah, I think there are quite a few trade-offs to consider when you're going between the two extremes, really fast, really slow. Some of them are behavioral, some of them are physiological. If you go too fast behaviorally, there's a decent likelihood that you're going to have poor compliance just because it's so brutal, really dramatically challenging. On the other hand, if you stretch it out too long, you also have potential compliance issues because you're like, okay, I've been dieting for 9 months. This sucks. I don't want to do this anymore. So there's definitely a balance to be struck from a behavioral perspective. From a physiological perspective, if you told me, Eric, my goal is I'm going to do one bodybuilding competition in my life, and I want to have the best body composition I possibly can, I'm starting my cut now. Okay, should I do the show in 12 weeks or the show in 30 weeks? I'd say categorically 30 weeks. You have a much higher probability of getting lean enough. You probably will preserve more muscle mass, but that's usually not the question. Usually the question is, hey, Eric, I am 24 and I am beginning my competitive career as a bodybuilder. What should I do? What should be my approach to being a competitor? And the answer in that case is not necessarily do the longest prep possible, because if you're 24 and you have let's say you're a male competitor with a fat-free mass index value of 23, I still want you spending a large portion of your year focused on building muscle, not focused on cutting. So there is, in some scenarios, a pretty massive disadvantage if you start, for example, too early in your lifting career, saying, well, I'm going to compete pretty frequently, every year, every 2 years even, and I'm going to do these marathon cuts where let's say I start out and do a 20-week cut, I stabilize there and kind of get my feet underneath me, do a big old diet break for maybe a month or two, and then I do another 16-week kind of dig, pushing into the end there. It's like all of a sudden we look up, we've been dieting for like a year, right? And then we're going to do the competition. We're going to recover from that for, it's going to, take a little time before we're really back feeling like ourselves. And then before you know it, it's like we're almost getting ready to cut again. So I think that it really depends on the scope of whether you're looking ultra short term or ultra long term. But generally speaking, my kind of blueprint for people that are competing is early in your career, don't compete too often because you still need time between shows to make appreciable gains in fat-free mass. So I would say, like for an early career competitor, I'd say every 3 years is probably a good cadence. For each individual prep, you're talking, depending on how high your body fat is starting, I'd say we're talking like a good 20 to 30 week cut, 20 to 28 maybe. Yeah, that sounds about right. And yeah, that's probably the sweet spot for me in the sense that you're giving yourself plenty of time to do a really effective cut, giving yourself plenty of time to recover and then build some muscle and then do it all over again. So, back in the day, it was really fashionable. It's kind of like I wish I could take people back in time to when I was first getting into bodybuilding. There was almost no debate. It was a bodybuilding cut is 12 weeks. And a lot of that was taken down from the not natural side of bodybuilding, where a lot of these 12-week cuts were popularized. And 12-week cuts make a lot more sense when you're an IFBB pro and you're doing multiple shows a year, every year. And your cut, you're not quite as worried about muscle loss because you've got pharmacological interventions to take care of that. And you also have pharmacological interventions making the fat loss process a lot more rapid, right? So it's really fascinating. The older I get, the more I reflect back on kind of the fun, we don't know what we're doing era of natural bodybuilding, which wasn't all that long ago. You see that a lot of the biggest mistakes that we made as a natural bodybuilding world were from borrowing what was being done by folks using pharmacological interventions and completely decontextualizing it and saying, well, if they're doing that, maybe we should too, right? And I think one of the funny kind of applications of that is, if you go back, go find a bodybuilding magazine or like a muscle-focused fitness magazine from 2004 and go count up all the different advertisements of the perfect post-workout carbohydrate. And it's like, dude, you're a natural bodybuilder. You're training that muscle once every 72 hours. It does not matter. Like, you're going to be all right. But the kind of perfect carbohydrate rate of digestion thing, I'm left to assume was largely due to the fact that people were using a lot of insulin and growth hormone, which are kind of balancing this really delicate interplay between, breaking down glycogen, rapid cellular uptake of glucose. And I mean, if you're, using insulin as a muscle building drug, which I definitely don't recommend at all. I mean, if you don't have the right amount and rate of absorption with the carbohydrate being consumed in close proximity to that dose, you could very well die, right? Yeah. So it's really interesting to see how natural bodybuilding has borrowed some of these things that are really built around. Another great example is natural bodybuilders kind of dehydrating going on into the show, right? A lot of that is a direct offshoot of people using anabolics that cause water retention and saying, you need to do a water depletion protocol to account for that. And that's why in the non-natural bodybuilding space, we see so many issues with diuretics around the time of shows. So it's a really fascinating thing to see how that stuff trickles down. But getting back to the kind of root question, we never set out and said, oh yeah, 12 weeks, that looks perfect based on science. It was based on tradition, which once you contextualize it, really doesn't make as much sense when you're
Do you
natural.
think? Do you think on the flip side of that, there is other things that the IFBB competitors can take from natural athletes in the context of prolonging their prep? Because I know obviously you look at some of the guys now, like Chris Bumstead, very popular in the classic physique division, but I understand his prep is 12 weeks. So do you think from a health stand, I know he is very health conscious, but from a health standpoint, do you think there is any benefit to potentially drawing out their prep as well, despite having all of those PEDs and pharmacological agents available?
Um, I'm not as tapped into that world.
Yeah.
I think it's cool, nothing against it. It's just not the world I live in. So I almost hesitate to speak with any kind of pretend knowledge about all of the factors that go into that are kind of baked into that
Oh,
decision of how fast should this prep be. I do wonder. I mean, I know, for example, you had examples of stories of people who back in the day in the IFBB, they would blow up going into these shows, get massive. And then after the shows, they would totally shrink down. And, I think people who are less informed would say, oh, they're lazy. And it's like, no, they were basically saying, I know that being this big and taking the kind of stuff that makes me that big has a huge toll on my body. So I'm going to dip my toes in that pool, you know, use it when I need it, and then come off as soon as I can and kind of. And so I don't want to speculate on who's using what or anything like that or what kind of calculus goes into those decisions. But broadly speaking, getting away from any individual's prep duration and getting into the general should the IFBB type guys who happen to be using, should they be modeling their preps after natural folks? I'd say there's probably some other calculus in there that I'm just not privy to. That may have to do with, hey, how long do you really want to put your body through some of these other things that are part of prep in that world? So yeah, I'm not really sure. I do know that the if there were low hanging fruit there to say, hey, we're going to be the only people in the IFBB who do 24 or 28-week preps, and we're going to, you know, go win everything that's out there to be won. I feel like somebody would have grabbed that low hanging fruit if it was really sitting there by now. But who knows? Yeah, I'm not really sure.
if that was that simple as an answer. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how much of it is a question of, I guess, the individual starting body composition, um, and I guess the rate of weight loss, as opposed to, how long do you actually want to prep for? How long do we want to be in a deficit for, as opposed to, looking at things from the perspective of, hey, this individual has X percentage of body fat to lose to get to their stage ready conditioning.
Yeah, it means everything. So like I know lately, within the past year or two, I've been getting a lot of questions about like how long is too long for a cutting phase, like out of the competition framework and just I want to get lean. Does something bad happen if I've been dieting for 20 weeks or 24 or 28 or 32? And time is irrelevant there from a planning perspective. Obviously, we can figure out how long a cut should be as a product of the real decisions that we're making. And the real decisions that we're making are where are you starting? Where do you want to get? And what's an appropriate rate of weight loss to get there? That's what determines how long a cut is going to be. Um, Whether you're prepping or you're just getting lean for some other application or reason. And so there's no right or wrong reason when it comes or right or wrong duration. The reason that I say a contest prep often should probably be in that, let's see, yeah, like a good 24, 28, maybe 30-week range is because that tells me that you started in the right spot. You didn't get too far away from stage weight, that you were able to cut in that time frame at an appropriate rate of weight loss that is conducive to conserving muscle mass and other fat-free mass. So there are some assumptions baked into it when I say, oh yeah, that's the right kind of duration of prep. The big assumption there is that you are using a an appropriately conservative rate of weight loss, right? Because I would not say, if someone came to me and they were, you know, 75 pounds over stage weight, oh yeah, 24 weeks for sure. It's like, well, we shouldn't really be talking about prepping for, excuse me, I'm killing your audio here. I'm like
There you
coughing
go.
and sneezing. But anyway, that's life. But yeah, if someone's 75 pounds over stage weight, I'm not going to say, oh yeah, 24 weeks just like everybody else. It's like, well, we need to do a cut to get in striking distance and then figure out what our plan is for an actual prep diet.
So like a pre-prep phase to see, get them to an appropriate level of conditioning prior to starting the actual prep. And it's funny because we put an arbitrary number on it when in reality, oftentimes I've found the best results getting ready within a ballpark time frame and just being conditioned three weeks out or so, and practicing your carb up, getting accustomed to what your body can handle in terms of carbohydrate quantities, and that kind of thing. So I think there is probably, when we say, 12 weeks or 20 weeks as a hard kind of deadline, I think there is an element of um, time where you need to be in condition a little bit early if you want to get the best out of yourself, just so you can tinker around with a few things physiologically and make sure you look your best on show day.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really interesting because, like, in terms of rates of weight loss, I talked about being kind of like adequately conservative, right? So that you don't have this massive deficit that we talked about earlier. Um, and so a lot of times people say, well, if you're prepping for a show, maybe you're losing 0.5% of body weight per week, maybe up to 1% of body weight per week. And we know that you probably want to slow that down the closer you get to a show, but even that is a lot of times oversimplified and kind of assuming that you're starting within striking distance of your stage weight. So for example, what I mean by that is if you are, you know, 250 pounds, right, at the start of this prep, 1% of body weight per week is 2.5 pounds per week. And just the sheer daily deficit that has to be introduced in order to lose that type of weight on a weekly basis, it's pretty massive. It's not to say it should never be done, but generally speaking, I find that it's hard from a practical perspective to lose more than about 2 pounds per week, essentially regardless of body size. So usually what I would do is, start out and say, hey, let's go for 1.5 pounds per week here. Let's just start chopping wood, make progress, get down within striking distance, and then we can start looking at maybe some percentage based rates of weight loss and things like that. But yeah, sometimes you just gotta forget about the percentages and say, hey, we need to get moving. If we can get, down 30 pounds in 20 weeks, then we're going to be within striking distance and we can, kind of refine it from there.
One of those things that you have talked about is the cortisol, the stress hormone. And I guess when you're in a prep, one of the best preps you've actually put yourself through, you said you barely did any cardio at all. I think that was an anecdote that you
Yeah.
provided. And essentially, what you found through time, and I guess through the literature, is that when you do more and more, I guess, aerobic based activity, your sleep's compromised, you're in a really heavy deficit. The amount of cortisol in the body, and I guess on top of that, you've got work related stress, life things as well. Andrew Chappell, who's coming on the podcast, is he talked a little bit about how every prep, you always leave every prep with scars. Something happens, someone has a family death or a breakup. There's all these other different factors that come into play. And so giving yourself 30 weeks is great. But the other side of that is that when you are in a heavy deficit, sleep's compromised, all these other factors physiologically, it can basically lead to compromised, you know, metabolic adaptation, and the loss of lean muscle tissue. So I guess what is a more practical percentage of weight loss week to week that you can expect in the early stages of prep when you've got a little bit more fat mass to lose? But then also, how does this differ between men and women?
Yeah, it's really tricky. I mean, usually what people are really responding to when they say like, "Hey, this is pretty tough,"
Yeah.
is a combination of low body fat and the actual kind of day-to-day deficit. And so that's why, at first I'm not even really all that big. If someone's like way above stage weight of making a percentage based kind of assignment, because usually it's just like, hey,
Get it going.
regardless of percent of body weight, like let's try to lose more than a pound a week, maybe just shy of 2 pounds a week, somewhere within that sweet spot, and let's just start cruising from there, right? And then eventually, maybe during the middle section, it makes sense to say, okay, we're going to aim for 0.5% of body weight per week. That's in that middle section where you're not too far from stage weight, you're not too close to stage weight, and that's going to put you, you know, maybe in that poundish per week or maybe slightly below for a lot of people. Um, yeah, somewhere around there. And but then, the reason that I'm getting increasingly away from percentage based things is then you start getting toward the end of prep and you say, well, we should not be losing 0.5% of body weight per week anymore,
And
right?
it's like the
Like,
percentage that you start at is, if you've lost 15 to 20 kilos, is vastly different to the weight that you finish at.
yeah, yeah. So, and because like even at the end, it's like, let's say that you're trying to, you know, you're getting down to the point. The last few weeks where you're still in a deficit, you mentioned sometimes it's nice to get ready a little early and tinker with some things. That is true. On the other hand, um, the longer you're staying at that super lean spot, people talk about, like you were mentioning earlier, you know, stress, cortisol, poor sleep, all that stuff. You don't have that for 30 weeks in a 30-week prep. You have that for 7 weeks in a 30-week prep. And it's not random. It's the last seven. Like it's mostly the being lean part more than it is the being in prep part. Um, so I also would encourage people to think very carefully about how long you actually want to stay being both lean and in a deficit. So getting ready early is fine, but maybe don't get ready 12 weeks early and then just suffer for 3 months, right? So that's an important thing to consider as well. But anyway, yeah, it's really tricky because, like I said, percentages at the beginning of prep can lead you to deficits that are impractically large because your body weight is so much higher. And then at the end of prep, it's like if you're in those last few weeks when you're trying to lose those last grams of fat, you're trying to bring out the detail in your hamstrings and your glutes, for example, trying to bring out those last bits of detail and striation, you should not be losing 0.5% of body weight per week. If you are, then there's a pretty good chance that you're not losing good weight, right? You're probably losing some muscle tissue because you don't have that much fat to lose on a week to week basis. So yeah, I mean, I definitely get it. And like earlier in my career, it's like when you're writing, for example, I've been a co-author on some really nice papers, in my opinion, on how to prep for bodybuilding. And of course, it intuitively makes sense if all you get is a paragraph to say, okay, yeah, let's go with, this percent of body weight per week. And then, you'll be losing more weight at the beginning, less weight at the end. That makes sense intuitively. But then you start thinking through all the and the thing that really changed my thinking about this was I've done a couple projects now where I've helped out with mobile application development, um, and it's like you think about not just how is this going to work in the perfect scenario, but how is this going to work in every scenario? So like it's one thing to say like, well, when I'm coaching, we do this. And it's like, yeah, but think of all the assumptions of who you're working with. It's kind of a fairly homogeneous population that you're describing. That's so much different than saying, here's an application. It's on the app store. Anyone can download it and start using it tomorrow. And it's like, are you sure that your recommendations are going to be right for female bikini athlete, 5'3", 113 pounds, and guy transitioning from college football to bodybuilding, 6'4", 310 pounds. It's like you have to really think through, like, am I sure that, 0.5 to 1% of body weight per week is the number? Because you start to kind of think through these extremes. So all of that is to say, I'm not necessarily sold on the idea of taking a single percentage and kind of writing it out. I do think in the meat of prep, if we look at that point where you're within striking distance as the starting point, and then the end point when you're not doing the final details, that main cruising period of prep, that's where 0.5% of body weight to maybe up to 1% of body weight per week makes sense. But before and after that, you have to get more creative, and the percentages start to break down a little bit, in my opinion.
So what are some of the factors which actually lead to the slowing down of metabolism during prep? Is there such a thing as, metabolic damage that can occur late in a prep if you do prolong things too much?
I wouldn't say metabolic damage. Metabolic adaptation will happen for the vast majority of people. The question is how much. There seems to be some degree of variability from person to person anecdotally. Empirically, we have not worked out conclusively the magnitude of true inter-individual variation there and the exact factors that necessarily cause it. We can speculate as to what seems to make it worse or better within an individual. But anyway, when someone's prepping, there's a high likelihood, more often than not, you're going to be experiencing some metabolic adaptation no matter what you do, because that's just how it seems like that's how the human body responds to getting leaner and being in an energy deficit, is that we kind of down regulate some less essential elements of energy expenditure. And some of that is actually probably just, it's probably the other side of the coin when we think of some of the benefits of dieting and getting leaner, right? So let's say we have someone they got a BMI of 40, and we tell them, what's really troubling, one of the troubling pathophysiological elements of obesity is chronic inflammation, right? Well, when we take someone from that state and we put them on a deficit, they start losing weight. And let's say now, instead of being at a BMI of 40 and being in a fairly chronic small energy surplus, now they're at a BMI of 26 and they're still in a small energy deficit. Their baseline inflammation, that chronic inflammation, is going to look totally different. And that inflammatory response takes energy. And so you could argue that part of that is being folded into to some of what we see in some applications of metabolic adaptation. But either way, what's going on is energy expenditures dropping more than we would expect from just the pure loss of body mass. And on top of that, we also probably have some exercise energy compensation. So basically, we'd like to think that if we, for example, during prep said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add 100 calories worth of cardio 7 days a week, and therefore my total daily energy expenditure is going to go up by 100 calories. In reality, it won't. In the vast majority of cases, especially during a prep, it'll only go up by a percentage of that 100 calories. Best estimate is 70%, but I don't feel good about that estimate at all. I think that we have a lot more work to try to figure out what that really looks like, especially for lean people in a deficit. That number could be much lower than 70.
So you're saying when there is metabolic adaptation, if you're, say, going for 30 minutes of walking, might be 120 calories, you're saying that in reality, you're only really expending about 70% as a rough approximation.
The tricky thing is we're not exactly sure where the compensation is occurring. But what we can say is, even if you say, and what I mean by that is, like, There could be some small changes in the actual energy efficiency of the exercise bout. But even if we did have you hooked up to an indirect calorimeter and we are measuring and you said you're not getting off the treadmill until you burn those 120 calories in this walking session, your total daily energy expenditure would probably not go up by 120 because through other parts of the day you will probably conserve energy elsewhere to compensate for that.
That kind
So
of that kind of feeds into like non-exercise activity thermogenesis and adaptations in muscle efficiency.
correct. Yeah, that to me, um, speaking only for myself and for none of my colleagues, because this is really speculative, I am increasingly, I wouldn't say convinced, but interested in exploring the possibility that, when we look at metabolic adaptation, just the response to dietary restriction, we tend to see reductions in energy expenditure and they tend to be impacting non-exercise activity thermogenesis. And I think you could make the argument that a large portion of that is the calories that we spend moving around throughout the day uh, reflect an increased efficiency of that movement. So even if, for example, you maintain the same step count, the actual calories burned per step seem to be reduced. I am increasingly interested in the possibility that that is also what's happening when we see exercise energy compensation during a deficit. So the reason that it's important and the reason that I frame it that way is sometimes people say, hey, this metabolic adaptation could happen and this exercise energy compensation could happen. And we believe that because of those, you will be less inclined to take steps throughout the day. Therefore, track your steps and make sure you hit 10,000 a day. My suggestion is you may be less inclined to take steps and you may find subconsciously that your step count drops if you're not paying attention to it. But I would also contend that the actual cost of, calories per step probably is also dropping. So even if you kept your step count totally stable, I think we'd still probably see a drop in non-exercise activity thermogenesis.
You also see that though, as someone becomes progressively lighter, they're expending less calories during that. Say they're doing 10,000 steps, 10 to 12,000 steps per day over the course of, say, a 2 month period. If they've dropped a couple of kilograms, they're obviously expending less per step as well. So how much of a factor does that
In the real world, that probably factors in, but that has been experimentally controlled for, at least when in the metabolic adaptation literature. There's a really cool study by the Rosenbaum and Liebel group over at Columbia where it was super smart, really cool study. They had these people lose about, I think, at least 10% of their body mass, and they looked at the energy cost of cycling at three different intensities and they actually did DEXAs so they could look at limb specific weight loss. And they used these little tiny weights to replace the weight of the limbs. So even when they were cycling with a leg that weighed the same as before their weight loss. So they even accounted for that and still found that the efficiency of movement increased after weight loss. So each pedal with the same amount of force and the same weight of the leg, it burned fewer calories. And yet, when you're talking per pedal, then it's a tiny little fraction of a calorie, but the energy cost went down.
very interesting?
Yeah.
The leptin, so that hormone, we talked a little bit about cortisol, but in terms of, one of the most influential hormones associated with those changes during a diet, what do we see with leptin, and what kind of strategies in relation to, refeeds, diet breaks? How do these things kind of positively influence leptin within the body, and how it acts on the different organs within our body, and also satiation and that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's tricky because first of all, leptin, we talk about metabolic adaptation already. Leptin is what's driving that. And you can probably tell as we're almost an hour in here, I don't often speak in absolutes, but that's an absolute. Leptin is a massive, if not the driver of metabolic adaptation. Leptin goes up to its receptors in the hypothalamus, a structure in the brain. The hypothalamus integrates all this information about energy intake and expenditure and coordinates a response accordingly. So with that in mind, people have said, well, what if we gave people exogenous leptin and said like, well, does that attenuate some of these metabolic adaptations? And the answer is unequivocally yes. When you take someone in a metabolically adapted state, usually the kind of standard for that is having someone lose at least 10% of their body mass and kind of maintain it. If you just inject leptin, a lot of this stuff just kind of disappears. It's really incredible. And we can even, what's really fascinating is in amenorrheic and oligomenorrheic females who have been, energy restricted and lean. Leptin is actually a really effective intervention for restoring a regular menstrual cycle as well, because of how the hypothalamus not only coordinates this information about energy balance, but the hypothalamus is also the beginning of that multi-step hormone cascade that leads to, sex hormone regulation and production. So leptin is huge. And as a result, intuitively, scientists are no dummies. They start thinking, well, wait a minute. Scientists and bodybuilders who just don't want to deal with this crap, say, well, is there something we can do that's not exogenous leptin administration? Because that's not a practical intervention. And what is really fascinating is that leptin is pretty responsive to dietary intake. We can acutely spike leptin by consuming an excess of calories, being in a short-term caloric surplus, and especially if that short-term surplus is coming from carbohydrate. So leptin is responsive to energy balance, but also carbohydrate is a pretty big driver. So people started getting into these potential strategies of, well, what if we did for a day or two really elevated carbohydrate intake in the form of a refeed? Or what if over the course of a week or two, we had maybe less of an elevation, but a more sustained elevation of calorie intake, got out of a deficit into neutral energy balance, not a surplus, but we made sure we were getting plenty of carbohydrate along the way. So that'd be more of a diet break type strategy. And there have been some papers that have looked promising, other papers that have looked a lot more underwhelming. All the research in this area that I've personally been involved with, I went in with high hopes, ended up being a little disappointed in the lack of effect demonstrated by refeeds and diet breaks. But there's a huge caveat to that, which is that the studies we've been doing, a major benefit is that they've been in resistance trained individuals. A major downside is that it's really tough to just say, hey, we're going to post a flyer outside the campus gym that says, hey, we're doing this study. We're going to have you lose like 30 pounds or something. It's really hard to do that type of intervention where someone's like, obviously someone who's a really avid lifter has their own fitness goals. It's hard to say, hey, by the way, we're going to pull you aside and just completely change the trajectory of whatever you're training for. So when you look at the studies that we've conducted up to this point, they have failed to show a meaningful effect in the realm of metabolic adaptation and things like that. But they also, we're doing these refeeds or diet breaks in the context of really modest weight loss. People that are only losing a couple kilograms, people that are not, males at 5% body fat, females at 12% body fat. I mean, these, we're looking at people who are lean and muscular, but they're not shredded. So we have really no reason in hindsight to anticipate that these folks would have dramatic metabolic adaptation to be improved upon, right? So the analogy I often use as someone who's allergic to bees is if you're testing bee repellent, you probably want to make sure there's some bees in the area, Same thing if you're testing shark repellent, don't do it in a lake, right? You're probably not going to find a shark in there. So the repellent looks just as ineffective as the placebo because there's nothing to solve here, right? So that's kind of the two metaphors I lean on when trying to explain why, yes, we have failed to identify the anticipated effect, but we probably, in hindsight, shouldn't have expected it to work in those scenarios, which means that at this point, I remain open to the idea that refeeds and diet breaks will have some modest effect, but I am not fully convinced yet. I think the real benefits that we can hang our hat on for now with refeeds and diet breaks come down to some more practical elements, right? So when
Clearly.
you've been, when you've been restricting really hard and you're pretty lean, it feels nice to get a little break from that, get a little short-term increase in calories. A lot of times, short-term performance improves. So, for in the case of refeeds, if you are prepping for a bodybuilding show and there's one muscle group that's really lagging, maybe you decide to have a refeed the day before you train that muscle group each week. Um, uh, Practically speaking, maybe you have a social engagement where there's some food or beverages you want to consume, and it's every Friday night. Maybe we do a refeed day on Friday to kind of make that a little bit more easy to integrate into your prep. So there's a lot of potential advantages that are more on the practical side. On the physiology side, I'm open to it, but I will admit that my optimism is not as high as it used to be based on kind of the totality of the literature, not just the studies I alluded to that we've conducted, but it does seem, for good reason, again, now when I show up to work, I go to a building that says evolutionary anthropology on the side, right? It does not make a lot of sense to me. Let's say you're a hunter gatherer, we're going back to, earlier in our evolutionary history. You've been having no success hunting, no success foraging. You're in a big deficit. You're getting very lean. You have minimal fat stores left to rely on. But man, what a lucky day. You stumble upon this beautiful bush with a ton of berries. You get this big carb heavy refeed, finally a good day of foraging. Do we really expect that it would be beneficial for your body to say, oh, cool, I guess we don't have a problem anymore? So, all that stuff we were doing to conserve energy and prevent starvation, we're just going to throw that out for at least a month, right? Because we're good. We had berries one day. Um, I think that kind of keeps me a little grounded in terms of setting expectations for like, do we really think that this evolutionary set of adaptations carefully cultivated over generation after generation, do we really think that we're three Pop Tarts away from fooling it? Um, and I would say no, out of nothing other than humility and kind of a sober look at the evidence so far.
Is there any benefit to doing back-to-back refeeds as opposed to splitting them out throughout the week? Is something that
Um, I think you could almost view that as like actually, that's probably a bad analogy. I'll punt on that one. I like using analogies and metaphors when you can justify them, but there's nothing worse than a bad one. So I'll leave that one in the brain bank there and try to work on it for later. But I think there is potential for benefit. If we believe that there's anything to be done with leptin, then you would have a much higher chance of actually moving the needle by doing back-to-back refeeds rather than one single day of higher intake. So if you're hoping for any benefit in that area, yes, there's probably some advantage of, if you were going to feel kind of good from one day of refeeding, you're probably going to feel better from two. So from a psychological side, from performance in the gym side, I do think there's practical advantages of having two in a row. It basically compounds the effect that we would anticipate from just having one on Sunday and one on Wednesday. Personally, I'd say, hey, let's call it Saturday, Sunday, and really do something with it.
Yeah, the only thing that I think, the only practical consideration in the context of back-to-back refeeds would be if you're, as you say, having a slightly increased carbohydrate content, say before you train legs, because obviously a larger muscle group, you're going to be moving a lot more weight, muscle tissue. Um, and then the next day, you back up with deadlifts or a really heavy back workout, there's likely going to be a lot of residual fatigue from that leg session as well. So, I guess from a more practical standpoint, would you say if you are refeeding to try and maximize your performance in the gym for certain muscle groups, would it be better to maybe space those refeeds out?
Um, it really would depend on your training split. If you, it comes down to this, in my opinion.
Mm.
If there's one workout that you're like, this is the star workout of my prep, and I want my performance to be maximized at this one that happens to take place on Wednesday morning, I would do Monday, Tuesday refeeds. You
Sure.
know, just have your kind of double up on them, and whatever glycogen you're going to be able to put in that muscle group, it's going to be maximized by Wednesday morning from that 2 day lead up. If you said, hey, I need everything I can get out of my leg workouts, I train legs on Wednesday and Saturday, then Wednesday and Saturday morning, then I would say if those are both equally important to you and you want to try to bring your best to both of them and kind of leverage refeeds maximally for that, then I'd do the day before and space them out like that. So yeah, it like I said, when you asked the question, my first thing was like, if we believe we're doing something here with leptin, then the 2 day in a row starts to look like the winner. If it's purely practical for training purposes, then it really comes down to your split. And are you trying to maximize, are you trying to go all in on this one special workout per week, or are you trying to kind of divvy that up across two?
So what you did was mention a few of the different considerations around the reproductive side effects for women, with being in quite a heavy deficit when it comes to the menstrual cycle. But for males in particular, and testosterone, what can we kind of expect? What do you see?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
I guess what do you see in terms of reproductive side effects that come through sustained um, calorie deficit, particularly when you're getting
Hmm.
down to those very lean body composition
Yeah.
males?
Yeah, it seems to be a matter of both, like you alluded to, the energy deficit and or leanness. But with males, we see a really equivalent or analogous situation as what we see with females. So with female competitors who are getting lean in a deficit, a lot of times we see an alteration of sex hormone production, a down regulation, which usually causes irregularity of the menstrual cycle and essentially puts them in an acute state of infertility or impaired fertility. And we see an analogous situation in males where testosterone levels start to drop very precipitously and libido drops very precipitously. And so we see an analogous situation where that individual is also less likely to participate in uh, reproduction, right? And actually, through the drop in testosterone and libido, much less likely that reproduction would be occurring in that scenario. And that it does conserve energy at the individual level. But I also think it's really fascinating from an evolutionary perspective. Um, if you think about a small community of hunter gatherers who, in that small population, there is a shortfall of energetic resources, the absolute last thing you would ever want to do is introduce more individuals into that population via reproduction. So you can see how there's not only the individual benefit, especially when you consider the energy cost on the female side of the equation of, building a embryo to fetus to newborn and then lactation on top of that. But even kind of zooming out at the population level, clearly this is not a situation from an evolutionary perspective where adding new members to the population makes any sense energetically. So it's a really fascinating kind of look at how those pressures might have informed some of those adaptations.
I really like the evolutionary perspective that the research center you're working in has kind of given you in this respect, like looking at things, taking a step back and looking at things from
Yeah, it's
many years ago. Yeah.
it's really fun. You know, I did my undergraduate, my master's, and my PhD in very exercise focused programs. Um, and they were great. And that's still my bread and butter. That's still what I love to do. It's what I'll do in the future. But for my postdoctoral training, I basically went out. I co-founded an app company. I left that. I took more than a year out of the app space entirely, just doing other stuff. And I essentially went back, got a postdoc position at Duke here, working with Herman Poncer. And like I said, it's evolutionary anthropology where we can kind of take a different lens and look at some of these topics. And it's fascinating. It's, you know, when I go into a lab seminar, or not a lab seminar, but like a department seminar, and we're bringing in a researcher, I have no idea what we're going to be talking about. It could be the evolution of lemur ankle morphology and how it impacts leaping. It could be the discovery of Homo naledi over in South Africa and what this tells us about Homo sapiens kind of trajectory of evolution. It could be about exercise. I do not know, and it's been a really intellectually stimulating environment with a lot of really brilliant thinkers who look at problems totally differently than I ever have. And it's been such an enriching experience that it's got me even more excited about the things I had been doing. So like I said, after exiting my former app focused company, I took more than a year off of just doing nothing app related at all. But just very, very recently got kind of back into working on a project in that space because I'm like, oh man, like I'm like rediscovering passions that I had through completely different ways of thinking that are a lot of fun. Like I said, just intellectually super stimulating, and it's just a great academic environment. I've really loved it.
Yeah, it's really intriguing. I guess the way you found yourself, very different to what I've ever heard of. Really, anyone working in the physical activity research space and finding themselves in an evolutionary kind of realm of
Yeah.
this whole new way of thinking about things.
I tell you what, if I may, I I just thought what Dr. Poncer was doing at Duke was the coolest research going, and that's why I said I want to work with that guy, and it
Yeah,
worked out, and I feel really fortunate for that. But I will say, zooming out, some of the most innovative, high impact researchers in our space, um, their PhDs are not in exercise science. You think about who's made some of the probably the biggest impact, arguably, on sports. Certainly on the supplement side of sports nutrition, is Roger Harris. He's a pure biochemist,
mm,
and he's the really the brains behind both creatine and beta alanine. I'm pretty sure Bill Kramer, who's like kind of like the godfather of strength training research, I'm pretty sure his PhD is actually in zoology, if memory serves. I could be wrong on that. I'm sure people will fact check me, but all of that is to say, I think if you're someone who's like going to get into research and you're planning on doing probably 3 degrees and maybe a postdoc, I would highly encourage people to do one of those. Don't care if it's your bachelor's, your master's, your postdoc. You should probably do your PhD within the field you really want to live in, but you should take one of those academic experiences, in my opinion, and go to a field that is related but pretty distinct. A place where people have been trained to think fundamentally differently than you do. And it will really be, I predict, a very enriching experience. That's been my experience.
I'll have to reach out to those guys if I can get hold of their emails, and I think that'd be great to talk to, especially Roger as well, just in the context of the creatine and beta alanine, and I guess they're two of the more evidence based supplements on the market at the moment. So it'll
Oh,
be
for sure. Yeah, last I heard, I'm pretty sure Roger retired and lives on his houseboat full time these days. So it might be tough to get him
Yeah,
on a
I'd get the
podcast. I
Wi-Fi
don't
as
know.
well.
But the reason I brought him up is like it's so cool. Like he's had this legendary career, and I saw him speak. He said it was going to be his last lecture. I don't know if he held to that,
Yeah.
but you could just tell like he thinks differently than anyone else in the room. Like he was talking about beta alanine, and he was essentially pleading to the audience, does anyone have a hookup that I can use to get aligned or kind of collaborate with anyone who does hummingbird research? He's like, does anyone know a good source for research grade hummingbirds? And I've never heard an exercise scientist ask that question. So I was like, this guy's uh, he just thinks differently, comes at it from a different perspective, and I think that's a really important element of innovation, in my opinion. Now, sometimes you're just wrong. You know, sometimes you think you're innovating and you're just you're just you know you're just following you're going on a wild goose chase. But every now and then, that can turn out to be a really special thing.
Now, I might be going on a bit of a tangent here, but in respect to beta alanine, I guess it's important in buffering production of waste products in the blood when we're doing, exercise, which is primarily utilizing the glycolytic energy pathways. Um, Now, I understand when you're talking to Steve Hall on his podcast, Revive Stronger, there was a part at the end of the discussion which I was quite interested in and I could relate to. And you guys were talking a little bit about, I guess, the utilization of cardio as a tool to get lean, but often it comes as a recovery burden. But also, aside from aerobic exercise, how does resistance training kind of change throughout the course of your own preps? Because I know that you've spoken about how you tend to prefer to opt for not absolute strength, like 1 to 3 kind of powerlifting um, style of resistance training, but those lower rep ranges deep in a prep and the rationale behind that.
Yeah, what I've found over time is um, essentially toward the end of prep, the word I would use to describe my physiological state is depleted.
Right.
There's just not a lot going on there. Flat, depleted. And what I tend to find is at a certain point in my prep, I'm getting ready for a nice set of 8 or 10 or 12, and I'm going through the repetitions. And then at 6, it's like I don't even feel the fatigue coming on. It's just a brick wall. It's like 6 felt easy, seven's not happening. And it's a unique way of fatigue. Normally, with resistance training, when we're well fed and we're not super depleted, we think, oh, 6 is kind of tough. Ooh, seven's a little tougher. I start to feel some burning in my muscles. Eight's a little tougher. 9, it's slowing down. We expect this kind of gradual onset of fatigue. We expect this, blood's kind of flowing to the muscle. I'm feeling a pump. I'm feeling a burn from some of the excess protons that are kind of accumulating, those excess hydrogen ions. And there's a very unique type of failure that happens kind of later in prep where you just hit a brick wall and you're like, oh, no pump, not feeling the burn. I just can't do a rep anymore. When I start feeling that more and more in prep, I say, okay, I think what's happening here is we just don't have the glycogen to make it happen. Not because I'm on a super, super ultra low carb diet, but at the end of the day, my body's using all the carbs that are going in. There's just nothing left. And so when I start hitting that, I say, listen, I could do 4 really high quality sets of 6, or I could do 3 just garbage sets of 12 for me to actually reduce my load enough to actually complete a set of 12. I'm basically seeing like there's no point in trying to target these higher rep ranges because I don't have the glycogen to make it happen. With the shorter kind of 4, 5, 6 rep sets, I do have the phosphocreatine recycling to make that happen. So for me, it's just a matter of let's not try to force it. Let's focus on the high quality training we can really manage from a biochemistry perspective. And so basically, I have a 2-tier set of changes that occur with my training during prep. The first set of changes is when I start hitting that effect relatively frequently, I say, okay, the high rep stuff is pretty much off the menu at this point. And so I keep similar or maybe even just a tiny bit higher set volume with lower rep ranges. Then you get later in prep, we're talking the very final stretches where you're starting to say, okay, I'm starting to notice that my third and fourth set are just going to crap. I got nothing left in me here. When I start noticing the really major set to set deterioration, at that point I consider dropping set volume a bit and really getting a little bit more picky with how much accessory volume I'm doing. I'm not leaving the accessories totally off the table, but I might only grab a set or two of things that I used to do 3 or 4 sets of. And if I used to do maybe 2 deltoid exercises in that workout, maybe I drop it to one. If I used to do 2 bicep curl variations, maybe I drop that to one. So my set volume may drop from 6 or 7 sets down to maybe a few, right? So those are the two big changes I make to training.
I think it really challenged my thinking when I listened to that because there was some interesting topics that you kind of touched on, which for me, I kind of have to retract a little bit about what I said with Steve Hall in um, one of the upcoming episodes, which will be released shortly. But
The preemptive retraction, quite rare.
I just realized that when we filmed this episode, it was meant to be, I think, episode 9 or something. And so we've pushed that back a month, and then I had Steve Hall, so it's all been anyway.
Yeah.
You can chop that up. But so I was listening to your conversation with Steve Hall, and there were some things there which challenged my thinking a little bit. And it does make sense, right? When you were talking about the glycogen depletion late in a prep, why then, when we get to peak week, are we shooting for higher rep ranges when we're actually trying to top up our glycogen stores? Why are we extending ourselves when we could be focusing on a rep range which is targeting that adenosine triphosphate system more heavily and then just focusing on pushing blood around the body instead of like, because oftentimes when you get into a peak week, right, you're doing sets of anywhere between 12 to 20 reps with 40% of
Yeah.
the load. That for me now, the way you said, and like if you look at professional sport like rugby league, rugby union, soccer, as you said, in a season, when they start competition, the idea is that they'll reduce the frequency of sessions and the volume, and they'll increase the intensity. So they might do 1 or 2 sessions throughout the week at high intensity when in the preseason they would be doing a lot more volume.
Yeah. I would draw a pretty definitive line between team sport periodization and bodybuilding focused periodization in that regard, in the sense that what also happens during team sport, you think rugby, you think American football, things like that. Usually during the season, you're spending a lot more time on the field. So there's less time for training and there's this extra added recovery burden. And you do not want to go out into a rugby practice, an American football practice, really fatigued, because now we have increased
Risk.
risk of soft tissue injury, right? And other injuries. So that is one reason to adjust volume and time in the gym and intensity and things like that. On the bodybuilding side, I actually still would advocate for a reasonably higher rep range type approach during peak week itself, because what we're trying to do with that training during peak week, uh, we basically want to try to facilitate a lot of glute 4 translocation. We,
Yeah.
we want to be doing, enough muscle contraction to really make sure that we're stimulating those glute 4 receptors to translocate to the outer area of the muscle
I
and
might just I
bring
might just
in,
stop you there. So
yeah,
for those listening, there'll be a lot of people listening that don't actually understand what a GLUT 4
yeah,
transporter is. So in my understanding, that's an insulin independent pathway. So you don't actually need the action of insulin to shuttle glucose into the muscle to be stored as glycogen. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's been a minute since I looked into GLUT 4 and all the different GLUT, there's GLUT 1, 2, all the way up.
Yeah.
I haven't looked into that, the regulation of those different uh, transporters recently, but I'm pretty sure GLUT 4 is responsive to insulin, but does not necessarily need insulin. So ways to induce GLUT4 translocation, if memory serves, would involve either inducing an insulin spike via carbohydrate intake or muscle contraction. So this is an insulin independent way of inducing this translocation, basically meaning these GLUT4 receptors are kind of making their way up toward the actual membrane of the muscle and bringing carbohydrate in, right? If it's in the bloodstream. So the idea during peak week is that when you are engaging in this higher carbohydrate feeding, strategy, you are doing the types of muscle actions that facilitate two things. Number one, really robust GLUT4 translocation, making sure that those GLUT4 transporters are doing what they're supposed to do, making it to the outer area of the muscle and bringing in carbohydrate from the bloodstream. And of course, you also want to be shuttling, blood to those areas with all the energy substrates that are floating around in there. So I'd have to go back and look at some primary literature to determine how much of a difference it would make if, for example, you said, oh, I'm going to do a set of 5 here versus I'm going to take a rubber band and do a set of 30 and really pump up to facilitate that carbohydrate uptake. But I would still lean toward during peak week doing plenty of that high repetition stuff, lightweight, just get the muscles contracting, get the blood flowing, tell the carbs where they're trying to go. I still think that that's a really solid strategy during peak week. Has nothing to do with recovery or anything like that. Has everything to do with how are we going to maximize muscular uptake of the carbs that we are consuming. And if we find that it's more because you could argue, well, but if you're doing all that high rep pump work, then maybe you're burning glycogen along the way. What do we care? During peak week, we'll just put more carbs in, right? No big deal. Like we could easily account for that. Yeah.
Yeah, very interesting insights there, Eric. And it's been an absolute pleasure to sit down and chat with you. It's about 12:30 over here in Australia, down under. So I'm going to get some sleep now, and I'll let you get on with your day. So thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks so much.
All right, good stuff, mate. Yeah, thanks for coming on. I thought that was really interesting. There was a couple of things in there which I learnt, which was kind of challenged my thinking a fair bit. So it's always nice to get some little takeaways, and I'll try and put those into some Instagram posts or something, try and conceptualize what you said. So thanks, Eric. I appreciate your time, mate. And we might have to get you on, in the new year or down the track again if there's any interesting, that paper you're doing with Eric and Martin. So I've had Eric and Martin on the podcast, so perhaps we could do a bit of mediate a bit of a roundtable discussion. You guys could share your thoughts on the key findings from that. But yeah, that'd be cool. So thanks, mate.
Yeah, that'd be great. Appreciate your time. Happy to come on, and make sure you get some sleep. It's late over there.
Well, also prepping too. So
oh, brutal.
I won the Classic Physique South Coast. So in Australia, we have down near Canberra and Melbourne. I won the a regional show there. So this one coming up is a state show. So I better get my 8 hours.
Yeah. Well, hey, congrats, man. If you're still getting 8 hours during prep, you are a lucky man.
Broken. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, congrats on the win and good luck in your upcoming show.
I look forward to seeing the paper when it's published. Make sure you send through the link, or I'll see it on your socials.
Yeah, will do.
All right. Thanks, mate. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Strength Connect podcast. If you enjoyed listening, please don't forget to rate the podcast or subscribe to our YouTube channel for more clips from each episode. You can also find us on all social media platforms using the handle @StrengthConnect.